here to discuss. On my left-hand side is Henry Wang. He's the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, CCG, and former counselor of the Chinese State Council from 2015 to 2022. Then to his left, we have Manas Chawla. He's the CEO and founder of London Politica. Welcome, Manas, to you as well. And then we have Hideki Hayashi. He's a project professor at the Faculty of Economics at Keio University of Japan. Welcome to you. And we have Grégoire Rose. He's the head of political dialogue and policy innovation, BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt of Germany. Welcome to you as well. Great to see you again, Grégoire. Last but definitely not least, straight from India, we have Sunjoy Joshi. He's the chairman of the Observer Research Foundation of India. Very warm welcome to you, gentlemen. So I would like to kick off with an opening question. In 60 short seconds, if I can start with you, Henry, here, which will be the future nexus of globalization? It could be anything. It could be China, it could be India, one of the new BRICS members, it could be space, AI, in your opinion.
So it's great to come to this strategic Bled Strategic Forum, and it's fascinating for the last 2 days. I really enjoyed. Well, I think the question is really hard to answer, but I think one of the phenomena we do have now is that we believe in the unipolar world for the last 7 decades, and then as I was in Berlin in May, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the unipolar probably is gone, and we're having a multipolar world. The challenge is now we don't have a structure to support this multipolar world. And I think, also the UN Secretary General Guterres said at the BRICS summit is that if the China, India, and Global South is not reflected in the current global governance system, you're going to have a fragmentation or maybe a more regional globalization grouping is making. So I think the BRICS is one good example of that, because people want to have an economic globalization, wants to work together. I think that's probably the theme, is that we need economic globalization going forward.
So Dr. Wang's point is that the BRICS could be the next nexus of globalization. Manas?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me here. At the risk of sounding trite, I think this is the future nexus of globalization. I think there used to be a time a couple of decades ago when most diplomacy and global governance and policymaking happened behind closed doors. It happened exclusively between governments, exclusively a stagecraft carried out between diplomats. But there's a reason that these questions are discussed in much more public fora now, such as the Bled Strategic Forum. And there's a reason that questions of global governance have now replaced questions of international relations. It's very much the intersection of business, academia, civil society, and diplomacy that I think will solve the challenges of the next generation. And I mean, if you really look at the history of globalization as far back as the Silk Road or the market reforms in the 60s and the 90s, it's always been sort of mixture of epistemic communities first that lead the way. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of this conference and many others like this.
Manas thinks it's diplomacy. Hideki?
Okay, thank you very much. And actually, I'm an economist and the market and business oriented. So I think the other participants seems to be political scientists. And actually, in this sense, I'm not so pessimistic as the most global players, both countries and the industries, will learn how to avoid the worst situation. So such as the second global financial crisis in 2008. So if they know, if we continue this situation, this will become the worst situation, like a climate change, which we will discuss later. So I think I'm rather optimistic, even if not immediately, but only gradually in the long term. I'm optimistic.
That's good to hear. Grégoire, your opinion?
Well, I'm grateful to my honorable neighbor for the optimism. I don't know whether it's because I just come from a... Thank you, sorry.
Yeah.
Does that work? Yeah, I do that all the time. I don't know whether it's because I just, out of a discussion on food security, which was a bit gloomy in terms of prospect, or because I'm French, as you know, all the French are pessimistic by nature. But I cannot say that the nexus of globalization I see is very exciting. I mean, we've seen three things. The first is obviously a rise of the acceleration of the impact of climate change on the most vulnerable communities, and this is fueling lots of things from bad governance to migration to social unrest. The second is obviously more complex supply chain, and we've been sensing it ever since the global pandemic. And the third is the rise of protectionism. So this makes for a not so tasty cocktail of fragmentation. But looking at the panel, I think there's one thing that will actually be the nexus of globalization is women. I mean, we are a male-only panel, and the truth is that whether we look at climate, whether we look at the role of women in many kind of different regional economies in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, they will be they are the hope, actually, and I think that's the positive note.
Women are the future. Yeah, we love it. Sunjoy.
Thanks, Martina. Pleasure being here and being moderated by you. We've heard the views of all my panelists. I agree with them. But I think this should have been the last question rather than the first. Maybe we would have persuaded each other a little bit more. We can get back to it. See, globalization today is a very contested space. We no longer understand what we mean by globalization. And if you start looking at a simple answer to the question, globalization historically has always been led by trade. If globalization today is in tatters, it is because global trade is in tatters. And if by globalization we mean the globalization which was run by the high priest of Davos, then unfortunately that version of globalization does not exist because those priests themselves have been defrocked, they've been tarred and feathered in 2008, and we do not know where we are headed. So there are other versions, there are other stories, other narratives of globalization which are coming out in the world today. We will be discussing in the panel to see where they're headed.
All right, so very open answer from Sunjoy. I would like to ask the audience as well, a little show of hands. So we had different proposals here. We have the BRICS countries, we have diplomacy, we have optimism, and we have women. What do the audience think? Do you agree that the BRICS nations are the future nexus of globalization? Hands up. A few in the room. Diplomacy. Also just like 2, 3, 4. And then optimism. Are we optimistic? Not so much. I feel rather pessimistic. A few optimists here in the room. Women? Hands up. All right. Okay. So we have a strong vote for women. I love it. Let's dive deeper into this topic of geopolitics now, which we came here to discuss as well. I would like to ask Manas, first of all. We have, of course, no end in sight with the Ukraine war going on, the biggest geopolitical shift since World War II. How will the world order change from here?
It's a great question, and I think one of the biggest problems of the way we sort of sometimes approach these questions is we look at it through a very historical lens. And so we apply the frameworks that used to work a few decades ago and we assume they'll work now. You know, the worst example I've seen so far is the US-China Cold War. It's fundamentally not a Cold War. The two economies are far too interlinked for us to be able to call it that. And so I think as we look towards sort of post-Ukraine world order, we really need to focus not on the sort of what we call sort of big power competition, and possibly not either on sort of middle power competition, but rather what I like to call geopolitical swing states. Because the sort of fundamental transition we've seen is this sort of, you know, detachment of the different axes of foreign policy. Before, there used to be some unity between your economics, your politics, your cultural, your soft power. Now you can effectively be a country that is a lot more pragmatist. You can have China as your largest trading partner. You can have the United States as your largest military partner, build your political relationships with Europe, and get by with doing all of that. And so in the future, we're going to see countries like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, like Turkey, Brazil, and India, effectively becoming the key intersections where the multipolar world order is decided.
We'll get back to this alliances and blocks structure and the BRICS as well here with China and India on the panel. Hideki, I would like to ask also for your business perspective as an economist. From your point of view, how do you think that we will, change this world order, and how can maybe, economies and business also help to improve the situation?
Okay, so I just said I'm an economist, and so I just would like to say how we can coordinate, so how we can find the coordinate points, and rather than the what I say, we can build alliance or blocks. That means yes or no. And in this sense, from the economic point of view, that Europe proposed the de-risking instead of the decoupling. And so someone claims that's a ambiguous one, but I think I can say it's flexible. So it's up to the global players can respond, and we can find the appropriate risk range. And on the corporate level, how we, it is quite natural that they will coordinate the global value chains based on such a risk assessment. So in this sense, we can find every time the solution.
Yes.
That's why I said optimistic.
The future of the world still depends a lot on the positioning of China and the US, though. But we have seen with the BRICS summit in South Africa last week, the global south is rising and getting a bigger and bigger voice as well. Sunjoy, how do you think will countries like India contribute to a new world order? And what kind of role would you like to see that India plays in the future?
You'd asked about the war in Ukraine. And the question is related, what you're asking me. See, something fundamentally shifts post-COVID in the 2 years, 2020 to 2022, and the war in Ukraine. In between, there is one date, 15th August 2021, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yeah. Now, there's a chain of events which has taken place here. And this chain of events basically has caused a growing divide. You see, the good thing about globalization was that globalization got the North and the South together on the same page. They were speaking the same language on most issues. There was an alignment on trade, there was an alignment on free markets. And gradually there was a coalition of the world. We lifted 150 million people out of poverty, even more in that period of time. So there was a movement forward. Suddenly things start going back. There's an iron curtain which gets drawn across Europe, moved 30 years back. There's a bamboo curtain now across which trade still happens between the US and China. You can't get out of it. And then there is this, I don't know, mud-reinforced straw curtain between the North and the South, which has suddenly resurrected itself. There are reasons for this. There are reasons for that divide coming up. So you asked me about the role of India. India actually no longer is, if you look in economic terms, really the global South. India has moved ahead of that. But India becomes that critical link. And the good thing is it is not in the Security Council. It is not a permanent member. The global South is alarmed by two things what are happening in Ukraine. As far as the global South sees it, the war in Ukraine, there's not one war. There are three wars taking place there. The first war is the war of aggression, the violation of the UN Charter, which Russia did, which everyone in the South opposes. They do not agree with it, just as they have not agreed with every violation of the Human Charter in the past. They've stayed back, they've stayed against. But there's a second war taking place. The second war is about the security architecture of Europe. The question is, should that war be fought with Ukrainian lives? There's a third war taking place. The third war is about the future of the global international order. The South is alarmed. The South is alarmed that neither side should actually decide the outcome, neither winner. There should not be a winner in this war, because if there's a winner and that winner decides the architecture of the global order, we are in deep shit. So this is the South's problem, and that is why, if you see the divide happening between North and the South, those are the reasons. So yes, India tries to play a bridge. India hopes it can be a bridge. I do not know if it will work, how far it will work, because this is a complicated space, it's a complex space.
Absolutely, and it's getting more and more complicated, yes. I feel as well. Henry, you were a very keen observer of the BRICS summit taking place as well, with the expansion of the bloc and including Saudi Arabia now and Ethiopia and Iran and so on. Do you think that this is the end of Western dominance, de-dollarization and everything? What is your future outlook?
Well, I certainly I do not think this is the end of the first generation of global governance, which is led by U.S. and Western countries for many years. I do think that is add-on. It's an improvement, because the first generation of global governance since Bretton Woods system I mean, World Bank, WTO, you know, I mean, IMF, all those things are great. But that has, you know, driven the world for the last 70-some years, you know, without breaking the Third World War. But now we're having the danger of that system is not really fully functional now. We have Russian war in Ukraine. We have a pandemic war, you know, also lost 20 million people. And then we have, you know, the second Cold War is almost happening now between China and the US. So I think, you know, we probably need some adjustment now to really how to push the, you know, globalization forward. I think, you know, our panel's idea was great. You know, now we need add on to the economic globalization, because I think that exactly China is doing. For example, China has, you know, economic globalization. China set up AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and of course, China has launched the Belt and Road Initiative. China has joined the RCEP, the largest free trade agreement in the world. China is applying to join CPTPP, which is another more advanced, you know, global governance system. And of course, China is wants to join DEPA, and China has actually set up a series of regional economic dialogue. For example, China-Africa Summit, China-Latin America Summit, China, you know, the Arab Summit, and recently China-Central Asia Summit. It's all pushing for economic globalization, including Shanghai Cooperation. So I think that kind of approach, I mean, we should really come back to how we can really save the globalizations that we have, you know, China, US, EU, three largest economies should work on the economic globalization. And let's you know, safeguard multilateral system like WTO, WHO, and all that. So my idea is that, you know, let's all work together with the common threats, rather than we're having all those regional security alliance beefed up, like, of course, NATO expanded. We've seen AUKUS, we've seen Quad, we've seen Dave campaign of China, no, I mean Korea, Japan, the US, all beefed up now. Yeah. So I think it's great that we should push for the market reform, market globalization, and economic globalization, where China is, you know, now in all those BRICS countries wants China to get to this biggest market potentially that's why I think it's very attractive to them.
Finding common ground is key. For that, we need more communication and dialogue as well. Grégoire, you advise a lot of policymakers and governments and businesses as well on, you know, how to improve their business models and so on with the BMW Foundation. On the economic outlook for the world, it looks quite bleak. The IMF in its latest World Economic Outlook projected that last year the global economy grew by 3%, 3.5% this year, and next year only 3%. So it does look quite gloomy. What is your advice for policymakers? How can they get their act right?
$1 billion question.
I hope they listen to you.
Yeah, well, where's the bank? No, that's a great question. I guess that I started the discussion by stressing the risk of fragmentation. Yeah. We are there in a way. We are seeing lots of different elections here in Europe, many important elections in the region later this year, next year, not to mention the US next year. And obviously the idea that interdependence is bad has hurt national sovereignty, has led many people to be left behind, is very popular. And so the idea that not interdependence but independence can make countries and communities more resilient is a new mantra. Actually, one has to try to understand why this is a mantra and adopt a non-judgmental. And I think when it comes to policy making, you can't just rule out and say, no, this is bad. No, you need to understand why this is becoming popular and this is becoming a political toy. But when you look at the world as it is, and we had again a session on food security before, and it's clear now that what happens in a country like Pakistan, a third of the country is underwater, 33 million lives and livelihood are put at risk, which actually has been fueling migration routes and so on and so forth. It has a direct impact on European lives. So whether one likes it or not, what happens very far away from here has an impact on my life as a private citizen and as a business leader as well. So I guess going back to your question on businesses, I think what we have been seeing over the years is a bit, again, I'm sorry to be, again, not very depressing, but not very optimistic in what I see, trying to be realistic. You go to a COP conference, you go to even that kind of forum, I still see a gap between the perception of the world as it is of policymakers on the one hand and business leaders on the other. And sometimes you say, okay, we talk about climate change, and you listen to the political perspective and the business perspective, and it's two different worlds.
Yeah.
And I'm not here the advocate of any kind of business, not at all, but the reality is that the pressure that is being put on businesses, and not just the big multinational, but also the SMEs, is much too high and non-sustainable. So there's a need to, because we also need the private sector in peace building, fundamental. Now, things are changing. We understand in post-conflict reconstruction, we need businesses, but we also need to understand what kind of fresh air they need. And that's important to recalibrate that kind of relationship.
Hideki, do you share this frustration? And also the question maybe coming from Japan, you have been looking at EU-Japan relations for like 20 years already. Do you think that Europe in specific is in decline?
Actually, no.
You are really an optimist.
This tie says it all.
Yes, this is, yes.
For those who can't see, he has a euro currency symbol on his tie. So he definitely defends European Union.
I say no because it's rather than the decline, but the, what I say, solid was stable. Because the idea, for example, in Japan, that the only estimating the economy as the growth rate is not so interesting anymore. And so how shall we improve the standards of the lives? So this is one good reason. And in this sense, Europe can read the various new measures, including the maybe climate change or any kinds of the, yes, which we will discuss now.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. You mentioned the word climate change, and also Sunjoy before in his opening statement. Do you think, Sunjoy, that climate change and the united, hopefully, fight against it could also be a future nexus of globalization, really uniting the world behind it? Or do you think we have already missed this window of opportunity?
Climate action is part and parcel, basically, of global economics and global politics. Let's be very clear about it. So if there are divisions in the world today, if there is a division between North and the South, and you've seen this play out in successive COPs post-COVID, whether you look at the Sharm el-Sheikh COP or whichever COPs have succeeded, the fissures are growing on climate action. And the fissures are deepening. There is resentment also that in this whole business of closing borders, trade borders, and introducing things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the kind of closed action, CBAM by the EU, cross-border adjustment mechanisms, these are all in the name of resilience, actually actions on trade. And these are going to be affecting trade. So there is going to be greater belligerence on the part of the South, and we're seeing that when it comes to the energy transition. And the energy transition, yes, is a long process. It is a complicated process. So how that energy transition takes place in different countries, because the same size does not fit all, the same energy mix does not fit everybody. There are going to be different choices taken by different people depending on the resources they have available. And energy today has become a weapon of war. The global financial system today has become a weapon of war. They're all threats to security. So when it gets clubbed into this picture between a security nexus, a business nexus, a finance nexus, these are the forces which are actually pulling the world apart. And you asked that question about de-dollarization. See, de-dollarization, no one wished de-dollarization. The world was one big happy place where everyone traded in the dollar. China was very happy trading in the dollar. The largest number of treasury bonds it holds is in the US currency. But something happened post-February 22. You hit the financial system with a battering ram. You uncame the sanctions. More than the sanctions, you suddenly cracked down on SWIFT. So that implodes the whole system. So if there is a doubt in everyone's minds, do we need to securitize ourselves financially? Do we need to securitize our trade? We must find alternatives. Whether they succeed, whether they do not succeed, how long they take to succeed, nobody knows. But gradually, the momentum is building. So you ask the question, how do we get back? What is the nexus? Ultimately, the nexus has to be the global economic system, the global political system has to coalesce, it has to come together. Now, after February 22, it is going to take a long process to bring it back because there's a huge trust deficit today.
thought-provoking. So we need to digest your ideas a little bit. Henry, of course, China has been trying to launch new initiatives on the fight against climate change. It was also a leading force in the Kunming Montreal biodiversity framework, and Xi Jinping announced new measures to tackle air pollution. I lived there from 2012 and to 2017, as you remember, moving from smog to more and more bluer skies. Do you think that China can really lead as an example also in the run-up to COP28 happening in Dubai later this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that China needs to be encouraged. Actually, I mean, we see European leader come, like Olaf Scholz come. President Xi said that no nuclear war should be fought in Ukraine, and then President Macron come and said that no bombing of the children. So I think that this kind of engagement is great. I mean, we also see recently that just right now the U.S. Secretary of Commerce is in Beijing, and then they said they're going to establish to vice minister level regular system twice a year from now on. So I think we need to engage rather than decouple, de-risk. I mean, it's a good example. If you're trying to de-risk, BRICS can be de-risk from the dollar, which, the old world we used to live is fine, but people starting to really starting all the silos together. I mean, everybody reinvent the wheel, and it's a huge waste to the human resources and financial capital. So what I think actually for this globalization nexus, we need to find some common ground to work on. And climate change absolutely is a big target we should all aim at. I mean, we see it happening everywhere. Beijing has the biggest flood in decades. There's 50 people dying in Beijing, capital of China. I mean, look at here too. I mean, so I think that certainly is number one issue. So I think probably we should have a G3 system mechanism, like US, EU, China, plus Global South. Talk about this global climate. I'm going to host an ambassador from EU and US and Chinese to talk about this climate change on September 21st, annual forum. But what I think there's more than that. We should have the globalization nexus is a connectivity. Yeah. We have U.S. proposed, they all follow China now, propose a huge, gigantic infrastructure plan. Like China has a Belt and Road Initiative, U.S. have a Build Back Better World, B3W, and EU have a EU Global Gateway. So that's great. Everybody realizes infrastructure is so important now. And I'm glad that Josep Borrell, the High Representative of European Union, said to Foreign Minister Wang Yi that EU Global Gateway is not in contradictory with BRI. So maybe should work together. So we need to find the common things to work together, rather than we are sanctioning each other, decoupling and de-risk, which is the lead to a very dangerous position.
Grégoire, you were just moderating a panel on food security before. So food security could also bring the world together, just like the fight against the climate change. But of course, with limited resources and natural disasters and so on, that fight becomes quite bloody or pessimistic as well. You have worked a long time in Africa as well with the United Nations. So how can we ensure more food security, energy security in the less and least developed countries of the world?
I only have the 1 billion question. That's a great question. I mean, the main conclusion of the panel we had before this one, actually, interestingly enough, we had exactly the same discussion with some of the same panelists in that same room a year ago, and we come up with the same problems and not solutions.
From here.
No, the reality is that I think two things, many very important things were mentioned by Sunjoy, by Henry. Three things. First of all, heightened fragmentation in energy and food. That goes without saying. And let's remind everyone that food security is a human right, a global public good, and that there was a resolution of the UN Security Council in 2018 stressing that any kind of use of weaponization of food security is a breach of international humanitarian law. Well, for some countries, it doesn't matter, apparently. So I think that this is just the first step. The second is how we make sure, and that's why de-risking is not necessarily, it's all a question of definition. Decoupling is a bit sensitive. De-risking means that, everyone tries to lower down the risk as much as possible. I don't think it's a problem as long as we keep engaging, which is very important. So many countries, including China, actually, I mean, I live in Germany, and we see that the German industrial powerhouse of Europe is having kind of identity crisis, because not only are do they need to produce at a much higher energy cost, but their products are not as popular as they used to be in China because the Chinese are actually manufacturing excellent quality product that not only do they sell in their home market, but in Europe now. So I think that de-risking as such is not the problem. The issue is how do we engage? How do we make sure that we enfranchise as many economic actors as possible and not just some dots on the map? Because I think that there will be no progress and prosperity without economic integration of the most vulnerable population. And going back to your question on food security, we need to have, obviously, the international, and that's another point that Henry stressed, we don't have the structures. I think we actually have them, but we are not willing to reform them, which is perhaps more serious than not having the structures. But we actually need to foster community-based solutions and start, stop crafting solutions from Berlin, Paris, London, or Washington. This age is over.
Bottom-up inclusion. We have a first question from the room. Please state your name, one question, and who you would like to ask the question to.
Not two. No, okay.
One afterwards.
Okay, I will go to second. Okay. At least, Tomi Huhtanen. I'm Executive Director of Martin Center, which is the think tank of the European People's Party. I'm from Brussels. At least in Europe, often we speak about globalization, we refer to trade. And so it was, it was referred in a previous comment already. So what we are seeing is the new rise of the protectionism. So how do you see the role of the trade? We have, for example, case of India, we have the EU-India trade negotiations going on. In Europe, we are maybe a little bit more enthusiastic than in India. When I was in Rising, there was not so much talk about it. On the European side, we feel that in Commission's agenda, trade is not anymore so much there. So how do you see the role of the trade and all, the WTO and all that?
The question is for Grégoire, right?
Well, okay.
Yeah. Who would like to take it? There's enough food for all.
No, excellent question, and I will be very, very short. Trade is fundamental. I mean, President Lula traveled to Johannesburg last week to attend the BRICS summit, and he engaged with many Angolan business representatives saying, I want our Brazilian agribusiness industry to do more, to engage more in Angola, focusing on sustainability, land restoration. So trade is absolutely fundamental. Once one has said that, one has to point out at the fact that we need to reform organizations. You have such a thing as digital trade. We currently don't have that much an updated set of rules. So the World Trade Organization is currently working on it. It is not that simple. I can turn to Arantxa González, who was actually the chief of staff of the head of the WTO for a decade, and I think she would speak about that much sharper than I would, much more sharply than I would. But that's actually important. And last point, yes, I think in Europe, trade has become, for some reasons, less popular than it used to be. But when we talk about the Green Deal, when we talk about agriculture, when we talk about the climate, we need to talk about trade, because it's also the way of making sure that you enfranchise all the communities in the discussion, and they feel that they participate and they don't feel excluded. And they have the feeling that whether you're in Europe or in the so-called global south, you are being left behind, and that the change in the discussion is driven by the few at the expense of the many. I think this has to change. But yes, trade is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to take this opportunity?
Concerning trade prediction, as I was going to mention about the BRICS, that in my mind, in economic sense, that they are keen to maintain, because they are still developing, even the economic size is already big, and so I think their priorities are high economic growth. So I think in this sense, they do not want to become the enemy of any major countries. So we should understand such a diversity of the different economic stage of the development, and so we should understand the such diversities, and based on that, globalization process will going on. I just short comments.
Thank you, Sunjoy.
See, unfortunately, trade barriers are coming back. And trade barriers are coming back across nations. They're coming back across groups of nations. So we've moved a long way from where we were. The whole question today, I think what we're discussing today is how do we get back to a world, is it possible to get back to a world where we somehow talk the same kind of language in trade. We understand, okay, what can be done, what cannot be done. We agree on what There's always existed some kind of protection. There's always existed some kind of barriers to trade between countries. I mean, Europe always protected its farmers. India protected certain sectors of its own economy. Others did that. There was a general agreement on what was allowable, which was not allowable. Now that seems to be breaking down. And that is happening not just across the divide which you're talking about, that is also happening between allies. I don't think East Japan is very happy with what happened with the IRA. There are problems that Japan has with the IRA. There are similarly problems with countries in the EU have with actions which the US has taken or the other way around.
It's true the world is facing a huge trust issue,
there's
right?
a huge trust deficit. So earlier when there was a crisis like this, for example, even I go back to 2008, the economic crisis, the world sat together and the G7 was expanded to the G20, got elevated at that point from ministers, finance ministers gathering to a heads of state gathering to deal with the economic crisis. And they did take, for good or for bad, it succeeded some of the times, it did not succeed. But there was, for the first time, coordinated action to get over the effects of the economic crisis. It worked for 4 or 5 years. Then things started falling apart. When time came for the plowback, for saying, okay, now you need to do quantitative easing, get back, that is where the differences started arising. And precisely at that point of time, when the differences got so straight, you had the BRI come in, the Belt and Road Initiative, to sometime 2013, 2014. So if you start looking at the history of these movements, or what happened at what point of time, there are reasons why we have got fragmented, why the BRI today is seen as a challenger to the Indo-Pacific. And these are not just questions of economics. These are questions ultimately happen to you of geostrategy, or of larger geoeconomics and geopolitics. So that is where the contests are arising. So when I started saying that there are different versions of globalization existing, and they're jostling for space with each other, these are the different versions, and there is a contest between them. Let us be very clear about it.
Henry, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, no, I think that's really unfortunate. We see the free market system is drawing back now, withdraw actually. I mean, the free trade spirit has been practiced for so long in the world, and which I think the US and the Western champion for that. It's unfortunately we see that has been really rolling back. And so I think it's really the key now. We like David Ricardo's competitive advantage, it's already out of window, and there's no more practice of that. So I think the world has to really collaborate, and whoever does the best should continue to do, and we should have a collaborative trust, like we emphasized at this conference, is so important. But I think something we could work together, like World Bank, like AIB, like ADB, FTB, European banks, they're all built on similar charters. Why can't they work together? Have a consortium and take a chunk of a BI, B3W, EU, Global Gateway, and help in the Global South. So we need to find something common objective, really to work together, rather than we are fragmented and decoupled from each other.
Are we making one step forward, 2 steps back, Manas? And can multilateral institutions and development banks maybe jump in and help?
I agree broadly with all my colleagues on stage. That works. I agree with most of the people on stage. I think we can't really talk about trade in the sort of the extreme geopolitical volatility we see today. We can't talk about trade without talking about supply chains. And when I speak to sort of business leaders, especially since after February 2022, everyone's minds go straight to Taiwan. We're thinking about if sort of military conflict erupted over Taiwan between the US and China, what would we do? It's become a huge point of thought leadership. It's addressed at most of the conferences I go to. Yet, if you actually look at the sort of microeconomics of it, very few businesses have a genuinely tangible business plan to mitigate what would happen if that. I mean, you look at Taiwan, 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are produced exclusively by TSMC. Very few people have a plan of how to adapt to that if there was sort of military conflict over that. So I think we need to sort of refocus conversations about trade really tangibly into what the sort of actors and agents involved and how they look at the geopolitical world emerging and address sort of the concrete issues there.
Hideki.
Okay. I just would like to add that the fragmentation needs globalization. That means that even before the fragmentation this time started, in Asia, for example, in the 1990s, Southeast Asia countries are afraid that China would take over their work. But actually, this was not the case. The complementary relationship emerged. And in the sense that on the other hand, for example, 2011, when the great earthquake caused the lack of some assemblies in this area, and so they caused the very serious effects. So the fragmentation process was going on, especially for the manufacturing industry. And I think Europe also will suffer. Slovenia has the good at the manufacturing. That's why I come here today. And so I think the globalization and the fragmentation, but the other reverse direction can be possible, that we global companies also request the globalization.
Yeah. Henry, you were a former counselor to the State Council of China, so you do have some insider knowledge and you know how the Chinese government ticks. How worried do you think should we be here in the West, but also across the world, about the future role of China, especially when it comes to Taiwan, microchips and the supply chains?
Yeah, no, I think that I understand. You know, there's a lot of concern overseas, and there's a trust issue, there's a communication issue, and then there's a dialogue issue. But I think the COVID, 3 years of lockdown and no exchanges doesn't help at all. And we start to see things starting to change and getting better now, with more and more foreign leaders come to China and China's visit overseas. But I think one of the things probably we should notice is if you look at I think there's two fundamental things we need to address. The first is this autocracy versus the democracy issue, because they say, Taiwan is a democracy, China is autocracy, then we have to defend Taiwan. But it's not that simple. China is actually, I would say, have a different format of a democracy. It has a consultative democracy, whole people's democracy, and one of the 1,000 years China practice is meritocracy. For example, every year 12 million college students are getting into the university by examination voting. They have to do exam, 12 years. And there's 2 million examination voting for public servant to get into the public service. So that has been done year by year, and China has done that for 1,000 years already. So all the official has to come from grassroots to village to the top. So you can see that system have a different democratic element there. It probably works for China. You have a long-term view, 5,000 years in uninterrupted civilization there. The second thing I would think is, of course, regarding Taiwan. I think Taiwan, like we could probably unite it like Germany and even European Union. I mean, all the economic integration is vital. There is about 2 million Taiwanese working in China mainland. There's about another 500,000 marriages in Taiwan across the street, and eventually Taiwan and mainland will be united. I mean, I have no question, because they have the same culture, same language, same history, and same tradition. So there's no question about that. But I think if you see, if the principle of no official ties is the principle that establishes diplomatic relations with 182 countries China has. But if you keep sending sending officials, congressmen, like the U.S. last year, 40 congressmen, senators visited Taiwan. And China had to protest, has to do some military exercise and things like that. So that people think, China is going to invade Taiwan or whatever. But that's not true. China is always responding, react. If you have the U.S. Civilians plan 60 kilometers to the China coast, and China has to do something. So I think we have to calm down, have to talk, and like the visit is good, and we have to better. And I'm glad to see now that the flights are resumed, trade has resumed between Taiwan and mainland, and hopefully the economic integration will prevail, and then people will have less, worry about this tension that in Taiwan.
We've talked about a lot of issues, but not yet AI. And of course, AI, generative AI, ChatGPT could become a next big actor in the globalization as well. Who here in the room uses ChatGPT, for example? All right. Oh, that's, almost half of the room. Manas, I know you're very much involved with these questions as well of generative AI, ChatGPT, and so on. I think you have something to tell us.
A few things. Sorry, there we go. A few things. I'm going to make sort of quick three quick points, which is, number one, I don't think we often really comprehend the scale of transformative change that AI has brought, right? I'll give you three quick numbers to help you understand that. In 2018, when the first iteration of GPT came out, it had 1.7 million parameters. The current iteration of GPT has 1 trillion parameters. And all the experts I've spoken to say that in 5 years' time, it'll have 100 trillion parameters. That's exactly, or what we estimate to be, the amount of synapses in the human brain. So effectively, in 5 years' time, we're looking at a world where we have an entirely artificialized computing power of a human brain. The second thing I think we really try to do is we try to split up the uses of ChatGPT and more generally generative AI and just AI into good use or bad use. But what we really need to realize is that effectively it's a tool that can be used in two different ways. There's military and civilian applications of both, right? The same sort of tool that you can use to create content for Instagram, you can use to create propaganda for the war in Russia and for the war in Ukraine by Russia. The same AI you can use to drive cars, you can use to drive tanks on battlefields. And so that's something we don't need to forget about. But I thought Martina posed this question to me a few minutes before the panel. I thought it might be interesting simply to ask ChatGPT what it thought about ChatGPT. And I wanted to sort of read you out what it came up with. It was a little bit scary. ChatGPT said, "Here I am, a product of technology, embodying the very changes I describe. Generative AI, like myself, GPT, stands at the center of reshaping the global workforce. While I aid in tasks, I also exemplify the concerns. Businesses will prioritize cost-effective AI over human employees, amplifying income inequality. Jobs might become obsolete. The paradox lies in my own role, a tool for both disruption and adaptation. Yet just as I suggest adaptation, I too face the inevitability of change. It's a reminder that the future I outline is as much a reflection of my own evolution as it is a prediction of the broader technological impact." The fact that it could come up with a response much more coherent than the one I initially presented should scare everyone in the room. So I'll leave it at that.
It's quite philosophical, and also that it says the paradox lies in its own role. So basically also questioning its responsibility quite a lot. Any remarks, any comments to that? Yes, please.
Hello, yes, thank you. My name is Marco Limbeck. I think generally about ChatGPT and AI basically is just a tool for us to help us develop ourselves. So maybe it's possible of many things, but it's a tool that will help us. But I wanted to talk about the globalization in general. I think it's going to continue for sure. It's just going left and right, up and down, it goes in cycles, in waves. So for sure there's going to be another wave of us getting together, because I think that we as people have a tendency to come together, to merge, to group. And sometimes somebody wants to get isolated, but in general we tend to come together. So for sure we will, no matter different policies and political interests and so on, who is up and down. And there may be different drivers, different countries who is there's always somebody who's driving something, and somebody who's opposing it. So for sure, maybe drivers will change. Maybe there will be new countries, maybe cities will drive the change opposed to the countryside. And maybe another nexus that we could mention is the climate change that can bring us together, because disasters always bring people together. It's us and the nature. So generally we care more and more about global change. Of course, there are people who deny it. Usually they are the same who promote protectionist practices. But I think sooner or later we will come together and the next step will happen, and I'm sure that the good forces will prevail 100%.
Thank you so much for your comments. Do you have a question as well? Just
Do you agree
quick
with that?
note of optimism. Very good. Who here in the room believes that globalization will continue? Oh, we have a lot of pessimists. Okay. Oh, as well. All right, very good. Okay. I wanted to also ask about the threat and risks of cyber war. Right. That could also be a nexus of, not globalization, but deglobalization. How worried is the panel about a third world war that could be a cyber war? Grégoire, come on. Yeah, Banas first.
I think there's a global cyber war going on right now.
Already?
And has been going on for a decade.
Yeah.
I think cyber war is not something that will take place in the form of a grand unified conflict between two different civilizations that lasts a certain amount of days and kills a certain amount of people. If you look at the actors, the agents, and the interests involved, I mean, you speak to UK businesses, 30% of British businesses are hit by a cyber attack every week.
Yeah.
You can look at developing countries in Turkey and Colombia, 90% of businesses, and these are very small businesses, by the way, that aren't even that digitized, are hit by a cyber attack every year. You look at some of the scale of these actions. If any of you have had the privilege to travel to Estonia, you'll know that almost everything in Estonia is digitized, apart from, I think, having to carry a divorce. In Estonia in 2007, because of a cyber attack, for 3 days, the entire country went offline. And so I think we need to reframe these questions to really think about what's going on right now and pick apart what we mean by war and what we mean by conflict. I mean, there's a brilliant colleague of mine at Oxford called Lucas Kello, and he came up with this wonderful book where he outlined the concept of unpeace. He says, the modern world, the sort of dichotomy between peace and war is very fragile. We fundamentally live in an era of insecurity and unpeace where we see thousands of acts of aggression every day. Whether or not you classify that war is largely a semantic issue.
Sunjoy, or Hideki first.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that the problem of this issue is there's no regulation for such hybrid wars because essentially no one admits that they are proceeding in such a new way of wars, and they have the incentives that if the countermeasures are found, they will willingly invent the new way. And so it's a very difficult task. And I noticed that the EU and NATO are recently closely working together, but it can be it can't be efficient, speedy process. And it is related to, can I say that relating to the previous comments of the ChatGPT, that I think these kinds of the continuous competition between the regulators and the innovators or inventors. So this is a fundamentally difficult question, and it depends on the EU and even the UK and the US. How to balance these, invention and the regulation, proper regulation will be different, and the EU has started to implement. And anyway, it is related to the, based on the basic understanding of the difference of the data. So data can be used for everyone. It's a US way. It's a social common goods, and the data should be protected, especially the personal data should be protected in the EU. So.
And worldwide as well, right? Sunjoy, what is your take from India?
See, cyber war and cybercrime, I mean, two aspects, two sides of the same coin. The issue with both of these always has been, how does it add to the cost of governance and securitization, both for corporates, both for governments? And a big question that keeps on arising time after time for businesses and today even for governments, because there is a problem when your capacity is challenged. The capacity to function starts getting challenged by acts of aggression of this nature. And most governments today are grappling with this problem of how to build that capacity, to be able to confront attacks which come from outside their borders. And most states have that problem. Yeah. The richest states maybe, yes, can handle it better. Poorer states find it more difficult to handle these acts of cybercrime. So it is, yes, it is a security threat. It is a security threat which can basically destabilize many countries.
It's still in our own hands and not in the hands of robots or machines, hopefully. Henry?
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly the challenge we're facing right now, the lack of a global governance and global coordination system for those newly arriving AI, digital, cybersecurity, all those issues. That's exactly global leadership is needed. And then the US, China, EU should work together. I mean, unfortunately, that was not. I actually have a proposal. For example, we have a G20 happening, going to be India. Yeah. But why can't I have a D20? Let's have a digital 20. the 20 largest digital countries should get together, or 20 largest digital companies. We should talk about those issues and then have proposals from industry, from policymakers, and then we can maybe try to have something going on, because otherwise this area is so threatening, and we haven't got a global system to protect us, and that is very dangerous.
Yeah. D20, D-BRICS, and so on, that's a great idea. Manas?
Really agree with that point. I think when you look at who will answer the questions of cyber in the future, it's not going to be the countries, it's going to be the companies. And I'm increasingly confident about that. Microsoft is a sponsor for this conference. There's a time when the US State Department was trying to create a digital Geneva Convention, and they couldn't get many states to agree. Microsoft came in a year later, I think it was in 2017, created the Digital Geneva Convention itself, got a few hundred companies to agree to it, but then also got the majority of states in the world to sign that document. Right? You look at the sort of exceeding power of these companies. Much of their sort of market cap is larger than the GDP of many European nations, and increasingly countries recognize this as well. They don't talk about it, but they know it. There's 26 countries in the world right now, and possibly more. This number is 6 months old. That all have a tech embassy in Silicon Valley. So this is not a consulate in San Francisco. This is an official embassy and a tech ambassador appointed to represent these countries' national security interests directly to these companies and in their headquarters there. And I mean, the first one were the Danes, and then they, I think, only came about in 2017-18. A gentleman called Casper Klinge. What did he do after he led up the embassy there? He joined Microsoft's European public policy team and then sort of went on the other side. So I think really trying to address these questions of cyber war and digitization and AI, we need to make sure we're not thinking about it in a sort of narrow statist lens where we still think the G20 or the UN might intervene and do something about it. Fundamentally, the axes of power have changed, and these questions will be decided by the private companies. It's just a matter of who, what, when, where, and why.
And we have to monitor and control them as well, business ethics, values, and so on. Grégoire?
I think two very important things have been stressed. The first is what Manas said, and I don't think whether it's very optimistic or necessarily positive that all that power lies in the hand of non-state actors. So of course that's a fact. They're much more reactive. They're much more agile. They're far more ambitious. Earlier I referred to the kind of gap between the perception of the world between political leaders and business leaders, but that is a real issue, and that is currently, if you look at how the EU is regulating all those big tech giants, a real democratic concern, I should think. So, and the second part is you've mentioned AI, cyber. It's, to be honest, a question of narrative. All the problems that we've been addressing in this discussion and since the conference started, food insecurity, we talked about tax policy, health issues, migration. Artificial intelligence could be an extraordinary tool to address all those problems. So I'm not saying that it's only bright and it's tomorrow will be fantastic and there will be peace in the world. Ultimately, I guess they will. We might not be there to see it. But when it comes to policy solutions, I guess the narrative matters because those technological developments are providing, you mentioned Estonia, small country that is, as far as digitization is concerned, as mighty as a much bigger country. And the last thing is, I guess, a mindset matters. And I very much like what I heard from Henry when he said, we should come up with a D20. I mean, this is exactly the sort of mindset that we need. Creativity, being bold and saying, hey, you don't align on many things. Let's bring you together around a table to talk about something that is not necessarily too politically sensitive, but will do business together.
Just do it, absolutely. So maybe focusing more on business and not so much geopolitics. Our topic of the panel is the future nexus of globalization. So we can't leave this room without talking about the next generation. Manas, you founded London Politica a few years ago. You have young people in your network, in your company from 34 countries speaking 46 languages. What are some of the top concerns for the next generation?
I think at sort of London Politica, we really try to look at overlooked geopolitical risks. One thing I think the youth is increasingly clear about is they don't want change on the margins, they want systemic change. they're also increasingly clear that the challenges of tomorrow are not the challenges of yesterday. And so when I see everyone, I mean, let me try to give you a concrete example. When I see everyone talking about the risk of World War III and the sort of nuclear exchange between the US and Russia, you know, reasonably all good things to worry about. How many people really talk about the threat of chemical weapons and biological weapons, right? We could do a poll in the room. Take biological weapons, the multilateral framework to mitigate the consequence of biological weapons. I'll give you 3 numbers. Raise your hand, right? How many of you think we spend more than $1 billion a year on that? How many of you think we spend more than $100 million on that? How many of you think we spend more than $20 million on that? I think collectively, at least we got half of the room. I feel like some people are still a little bit shy. It was a bit of a trick question. We spend $1.1 million every year on the International Biological Weapons Convention, right? We collectively probably spend more on drinks last night. So I think it's really worth being aware about if we're talking about multilateral solutions and we're talking about what are the problems of the future, to really condense them into the numbers, right? Money moves the world, to condense them into what are we actually doing to build the international architecture to solve these problems.
We have about 5 minutes left. Is there any burning question in the room before you go for lunch? Yes, please. One short question there and then the lady in the middle.
Mirjana Perko from Slovenia. How much money do you think is spent on preventing cybercrime?
I don't know.
You must have the answer.
You must, yeah.
Anyone in the room has the answer?
I don't have the answer, but I know that it's not coming from nowhere. So there are areas in the world that exist, and I'm sure that many politicians or many world leaders know about them. Like the whole area in Johannesburg is where they're doing cybercrime, and nobody acts on that.
Well, I can. There is one estimate which came out some years ago, and I can give you the source. $3 trillion is the cost of cybercrime. It's a huge cost. No, this is the cost to the economies. It's the ransomware and all that which goes around the world. Credit card theft and everything else. How much is spent on countering it? We don't have figures.
It's just estimates, right? We don't really have transparent data for that as well. We have a question here, one last from the lady.
Hey, it's Anya. I come from the European Crypto Initiative. My question would be, who would be the global lawmakers if you could name a few? We heard for Food Association, perhaps one of them. We heard that there's going to be companies, so happy to hear that that's going to be the answer as well. But if you could name a few stakeholders that you could perceive to be the next global lawmakers, that would be amazing.
Maybe quickly, all of you.
Actually, that's a very, very interesting question, which is, the whole, when we start talking about the future of multilateralism, how to get multiple stakeholders involved in the world, which, as Manas pointed out today, is far more complex, far more complicated, and beyond the capacity of certain, just nation states to address them. Now, that is a dilemma which we have not even started addressing. We did it in the cyber world. You had the INR transition, lots of things happened. We had the multi-stakeholder approach, and the world at that moment came together and signed on. Today, we are not really discussing of those terms. Today, we are far more fragmented. But yes, to move forward into a truly multilateral system, the way where we are, the sizes of the stakeholders who have got involved, whether it is, fighting pandemics, far more work is done fighting pandemics today or fighting diseases across the world by non-governmental agencies, organizations, than is actually spent by the government. So NGOs also have become very big in this matter. So these are important stakeholders which eventually do have a say and should logically, on a platform, have a say when the future of this next globalization is going to be decided.
Any final comment from the panel before we wrap it up? Yes?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I don't want to escape it, but we actually have one global lawmaker. It's the European Union. And this is a fact, on many things from hate speech online to product standards to health policy. The only issue, and that's the next panel actually, is that they mostly lead in trend setting, not so much in innovation. And the second foot is innovation. I mean, you can't be a lawmaker, as you put it, or trendsetter on the long run if you don't couple it with innovation.
Hideki?
Thank you. So actually, I enjoyed yesterday's last session moderated by the Sunjoy. And I was thinking at the time on the multilateralization. I think keyword should be the effective multilateralization. There was multilateralization. So that I think it might be the answer to your question that just like the common law, or based on the accumulation of the various activities, such laws are formed. And finally, it is related to my previous comment that the solidarity, which is the main theme of this year's forum, is based on the diversity. Acknowledging the diversity of the various big, small, and various countries, and so based on that, so from the bottom-up process.
Bottom-up, Manas?
I mean, I think the boring answer is going to be a mixture of business. Sorry. The boring answer. The boring answer is going to be a mixture of businesses, academia, civil society, etc. I think one group of actors I want to use this question to really sound alarm about is the rise of effectively, high net worth individuals as the shapers and breakers of modern society, right? I think, to sort of speak to Gregoire's point, I think it's actually quite hard to differentiate between laws and norms. Effectively, norms become laws and laws become norms. Sometimes, if you look at what happened in Ukraine in sort of early stages of the war, one of the first movers was Elon Musk, when the deputy prime minister of Ukraine said, Mr. Musk, we don't have access to Wi-Fi. On a tweet, he said this, could you please give us access to Starlink? In 7 hours, he replied right away. In 24 hours, the first Starlink terminals were shipped into the country. And that put Ukraine, some of the experts have said, connected to the grid and connected to the network for 3 weeks more than they would have been otherwise. That could have been a total game changer to the war. No one talks about it. It was all the mercy of one private billionaire who had access to this technology, which frankly, the Pentagon and the United States did not. So it's really about, I feel often we don't question the role of some of these people. They become media hype through Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. But they play a very vital role in geopolitics, and we need to start addressing that.
Absolutely. Final word from Henry.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent question. Who is the lawmaker? But I think that's the UN. That's the UN family, all those international organizations, WTO, of course. We need to strengthen that. We are weakening that now. That's really exactly, I think the objective is to strengthen the international system and multilateral system and UN-led system. That's really the key to the question. Of course, EU as well. And of course, many other countries, civil society, think tanks can also contribute to that.
And with those words, we came full circle because we need to finish this panel on time. Some people need to catch a plane. So safe travels from here. We talked about a lot of issues, the rise of the global south, inclusion of communities, bottom up, a new D20 to deal with AI and challenges like ChatGPT, which itself says that it's a paradox lying in its own role. But we do have some optimistic voices here that globalization will continue, but we need more dialogue. Thank you to our amazing panel and to you, the audience, for a great session. Thank you.